Hey everybody! We are going back to plants in this video, and we're learning the final details you need to know about how plants can reproduce. So earlier we learned about the different ways of reproducing. Remember, you can have asexual reproduction or you can have sexual reproduction, which is what humans use, obviously. But plants, they can actually do both kinds, and some species can actually do both kinds of reproduction. And then other species only do one or the other. So let's start off firstly with the methods of asexual reproduction that plants can do. Because these are pretty amazing. Remember, asexual reproduction means you're making a clone of yourself. You're basically cloning yourself. You don't need to reproduce with anybody else like humans do. The plant can just grow another plant that's a copy of itself. So the first kind here is called vegetative reproduction. Vegetative reproduction. So that just means growing more leaves or growing more roots or stems to then make a new plant. And here are some examples. So here's an example of a succulent type plant. And if you look closely on the edge of its leaf here, it's growing some tiny baby plants on it. These are called plantlets. Baby plants. And each one of these tiny plantlets can drop off. Maybe they'll blow across the ground somewhere else, and then they'll start to grow in the soil and grow a new plant. So this plant hasn't reproduced with any other plants. It just grows these baby plantlets and they fall off and they grow into some new ones. There are also some stems that plants can grow, like strawberries use this method. And these stems are called stolons. Not that you need to remember it. But that means the plant just grows across the ground, and then it attaches to the ground and it starts to grow some new roots, and then suddenly it grows a new plant next to the original plant. And if you ever have strawberries at home in the veggie patch, you can have a look and you can grow new strawberries using this stolon. And it also happens with roots underground as well. So, well, it's actually an underground stem. These are called rhizomes. You don't need to know the name either. But they're just stems that they grow underground, and then they pop up a new plant further along, and that plant starts to grow into a new clone. And you can actually go to big forests in America. If you've ever been to Aspen, or the area of Colorado, there's whole forests that have rhizomes, and the whole forest is just clones of one original tree. So it's basically one individual that's grown a whole forest from its single body, which I think is pretty amazing. All right. And we can also do vegetative reproduction as humans too. This is how garden nurseries make most of their plants. This is called just taking cuttings. Obviously, it's not natural for plants to do this, but if you chop up the stem of some plants and you plant them in the soil, you can add some special hormones too, they start to grow roots on the bottom, and then you can plant them and they'll actually grow into a brand new plant. So you can make hundreds and hundreds of plants from just the one original plant by taking cuttings of it. And I'm starting to plant a new garden at home, and here's a lot of cuttings that I just did a couple of weeks ago. And they're hopefully growing roots right now, and I'll be able to save hundreds of dollars because I won't have to buy any plants. I've just cloned them using this cuttings method. Okay, the second method of asexual reproduction is called spores. And the main type of species that do this are ferns. So if you ever look at a fern plant, you can see at a certain time in the year, they have these brown spots on the underside of them. And if you rub your finger across them, it's like a brown powder. And that's because these spots are just made up of a whole lot of spores. And all a spore is, it's just a cell, which then grows into a new plant. So the fern, it's going to release all of its spores, and then those spores will travel along to the ground. Maybe they'll travel through the air. And then when one of the spores lands on the ground, it starts to grow new roots, it starts to grow new stems and leaves, and suddenly we can be growing a new plant. So you can grow a new fern just from the spores. And remember, this is a clone. The fern doesn't reproduce with any other ferns, it's just making baby versions of itself. Like as if we could clone ourselves. Alright, well the third method, this is probably the most common method that plants use, because this is a sexual reproduction, a method of sexual reproduction. And the method is using flowers, which we've already learnt lots about. So we've already learnt about pollination. Now let's look at how it all fits together into how plants reproduce to make new ones. So let's go back to the start. Remember, we have flowers, and we have grains of pollen which are kept on the stamens of the flower. And then we also have the carpel, which is the female part of the flower. That's the female and the male symbol. So, when a plant reproduces, firstly, it has pollen in its stamens. So then, remember, the pollen in pollination gets taken from one flower to a completely different individual. During the process of pollination. So pollination is the first step. Here we've got a bee. The bee's taken some pollen grains, goes from one flower to the next, and importantly, it drops or it attaches the pollen grains to the carpel of another flower. And then the pollen grain goes down into the egg cell that's waiting here. Remember, there's an egg cell at the bottom of the carpel. And then, just like in humans, when a sperm combines with an egg, then it can start to grow a baby. Well, in plants, when a pollen grain combines with an egg, that can start to grow a seed. And that process is called fertilization. So once the egg has been fertilized, like I said, it can grow into some seeds. And at the same time that the seeds are growing, the flower dies off and it starts to make a fruit. So that's what we're eating every day when we're eating fruit. We're just eating the mature seed pod of whatever plant it is. And that's why if you look inside any fruit that you're eating, you're going to find seeds. So apples have seeds, oranges, bananas used to have seeds before we bred them to not have any. So once the fruit and the seeds are mature, then they fall off the plant or they get eaten by an animal and the seeds disperse everywhere on the ground nearby the plant. And we call that seed dispersal, which is the third stage. And then just like for spores, those seeds are going to hit the ground somewhere. They'll start to grow roots, and then they'll start to grow stems and leaves, and suddenly we can have a new plant. So that's the fourth step. The seed grows. All right. So that's the method that plants use for sexual reproduction, which every plant that has flowers will do.